You know, I find it utterly unbelievable that in 1888 a series of gruesome murders took place in my old home city, London. And to this day, well over 130 years later, the killer has never been identified. But before I give you all the terrible details, let me introduce you to Utterly Unbelievable. Are you fascinated by true crime mysteries and the weird and wonderful? I know I am. So if you are too, you're in the right place. Here at Utterly Unbelievable, I delve into the most chilling of true crimes, try to fathom out the most baffling of strange and mysterious happenings, and sink my teeth into anything weird and wonderful in the hope of bringing you a little of something that you like. So if you like what you see, please let me know so I can see what you like. And if you don't want to miss out on future videos, you might want to consider subscribing and turning on notifications. So get ready to dive into the world of mystery, intrigue and crime. So back to the 19th century, 1888 to be precise. During this time, England experienced a major influx of immigrants from Ireland, Russia and other Eastern Bloc countries. The majority of these settled in the major cities, and London was no different. Many of them settled in the East End. One of the areas was Whitechapel. Now in 1888, the population of Whitechapel was swollen to over 80,000. This produced really squalid living and working conditions, rampant poverty, and overt criminal activity. Crime was out of control and attacks against women were commonplace. Prostitutes in the area were as common as rats, and approximately 1,200 women who were working in the oldest profession in history were a regular target for violence. Overall, Whitechapel gained a reputation as a place where immorality ruled. And so this is the backdrop for our story today, a series of murders which became known as the Whitechapel murders. And of course, the killer was the now infamous Jack the Ripper, whose brutal crimes cast a shadow over the destitute East End of London. Now typically, his victims were prostitutes working in this area. Usually their throats were slit and their abdomens were viciously sliced open. At least 3 of the victims had body organs removed, and this led some to believe that the killer had anatomical knowledge, perhaps a doctor, a surgeon, an abattoir worker, or indeed a butcher. During later investigations, which we'll go on to in a moment, many of these were interviewed and their alibis checked. Now during September and October 1888, rumours abounded regarding the identity of the killer. Many letters were sent to the police and the press from people claiming responsibility for the murders. One of these letters, which later became known as the Dear Boss letter, was actually signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." And this is how the killer came to be known by this name. Even now, we don't know if this letter was truly from the killer, or whether it was the work of an overzealous journalist who was trying to hype up the murders and perhaps increase circulation for his newspaper. 2 other pieces of mail, of note, again purported to be from the killer. One was a postcard which later became known as the Saucy Jackie postcard. Another became known as the From Hell letter. This was sent to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. More of them later. The most chilling aspect of this last letter was that it was accompanied by what appeared to be half of a preserved human kidney. In all, 11 murders were included on the police file regarding the Whitechapel murders. These took place between 1888 and 1891, but not all of them could be connected to the same killer. The 5 victims, who are generally now accepted to have been definitely the work of Jack the Ripper, became known as the Canonical 5. These were Mary Ann Nichols, Anne or Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. They were all murdered between the 31st of August and the 9th of November 1888. And as I've said before, at this time attacks against women were rife in the area, and this made it difficult for police to establish exactly which of the crimes were connected. The first two murders on the Whitechapel file were not connected to Jack the Ripper. These were Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram. Smith is now generally thought not to have been a victim of the Ripper. There were several reasons for this, one of which was she survived the initial attack. She survived long enough to tell police that she was attacked by 2 or 3 men, not a single assailant. She was brutally bludgeoned, and a blunt object was inserted into her body, well, in her nether regions. This ruptured her peritoneum, and she was admitted to the London hospital. Unfortunately, she died the following day of peritonitis, which at this time was not treatable. The second victim was Martha Tabram. Now, there appeared to be no motive for this attack. However, she was murdered close to the location of the later canonical 5. She met her demise on a staircase in George Yard and suffered no less than 39 stab wounds, that's 39, to her throat and other body organs. She would later be discounted by police as a victim of the Ripper because she did not have slash wounds to the throat or to the abdomen. However, there is some conjecture that it may have been the Ripper who killed her, and he was just in the early stages of his work, and he had not yet perfected his modus operandi. Incidentally, there's an utterly unbelievable coincidence which connects Martha Tabram and, well, yours truly, me. I'll tell you all the details about that in a later short video, so keep watching, folks, if you want to find out. So let's get on to the canonical 5. The first of the generally accepted victims was Mary Ann Nichols. Now, Nichols was born in London, and she was married to a printer's machinist. She was the second of 3 children and went on to have 5 children herself before separating from her husband. She had a long police charge sheet, generally for drunken disorderly behaviour and, unfortunately, prostitution, which is how she made money for her subsistence. Her body was discovered in Bucks Row, which is modernly called Durward Street. She was discovered by a carman. That's basically someone who dealt in the day with carts or carriages. He was on his way to work and first of all mistook the body for a tarpaulin lying in the street. Only when he got closer did he realise what he'd found. Her throat had been cut down to the vertebrae by 2 deep cuts. She'd been stabbed twice in the genital area, and her abdomen had been sliced open and viciously mutilated. The next victim was Anne or Annie Chapman. Annie Chapman was born in Paddington, again in London, and according to her brother started drinking from a very early age. Alcohol became her weakness, particularly rum. She married and had 3 children herself, but again she separated from her husband. She earned what little money she had from doing crochet work and again, regrettably, prostitution. Her body was found near the steps of 29 Hanbury Street in Spitalfields. Her throat was severed by deep cuts, and again her abdomen was sliced open, and part of the flesh from her stomach was placed by her left shoulder. Another piece of flesh and her small intestines were placed by her right shoulder. A subsequent post-mortem showed that some body organs, including her uterus and her bladder, had been removed. There then followed a double murder on the 30th of September. The first of the victims was called Elizabeth Stride. Now, Stride, in fact, was not English. She was born near Gothenburg in Sweden, and her birth name was Elizabeth Gustafsdotter. She relocated to London in 1866. She was married, but had no children, and again, like the other ladies, later separated from her husband. She made money to live from cleaning and possible casual prostitution. Now, Stride was found in Berner Street, which is modernly known as Henrique Street. Her throat had been severed, cutting her trachea and her carotid arteries. But strangely, there were no further wounds to her body, and this led police and the press to speculate that the killer may have been interrupted while perpetrating the crime. The second victim that night was Catherine Eddowes. She was found in Mitre Square in the City of London, and this is where the City of London police also became involved, as she was found in their area of responsibility. Catherine Eddowes was born in Wolverhampton, not London, and she was described as a jolly, intelligent woman, but also possessive of a fearful temper. She too had a drinking problem. She never actually married her partner, but subsequently separated from him. He was in fact teetotal and couldn't cope with her drinking. She made her money to live by cleaning, sewing, and the occasional prostitution. Her body was found about an hour after Stride was found. Her throat had been cut and her abdomen had been ripped open. And again, her small intestines had been placed on her right shoulder. This appeared to form a pattern for the Ripper. What kind of message was he trying to send? Maybe you have some ideas. Tell me below. In addition to this, her left kidney and part of her uterus had been removed, and her face had been brutally disfigured. Eventually, these two murders on the same night became known as the double event. Later on, part of Catherine Eddowes' apron was found in Goulston Street, and it was found near a chalk inscription on the wall, which read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." It is still to this day not known whether this inscription was connected to the murder. However, some people think that it was meant to imply that the murders had been carried out by a member of the Jewish community. The last of the canonical five was Mary Jane Kelly. And Mary Jane Kelly's origins were obscure and unclear. However, she was thought to have told some friends that she came from Limerick in Ireland. She got married and began prostitution in Cardiff before relocating to London. At one point, it's rumoured that she worked in what was called a high-class brothel in the West End. Mary Jane Kelly's body was found in her own bed in Miller's Court in Dorset Street, where she lived. Her face had been disfigured beyond recognition, and almost all of her abdominal organs had been removed. Her uterus, both her kidneys and one breast were placed underneath her head, and other organs were placed near her foot. When examining the scene, her heart was nowhere to be found, and it's thought it may have been taken away by the killer. There were 4 later murders on the Whitechapel murder file, but these were generally thought not to have been connected. Mary Jane Kelly is generally accepted as being the final victim of Jack the Ripper. All of the canonical 5 victims were killed at night, either at or close to the weekend, and usually towards the end of the month or very close to it. And with the exception of Elizabeth Stride, where it's thought that the killer was interrupted, the killings became more brutal and the mutilation more severe. And this instilled terror into the impoverished community and baffled authorities due to their brutal nature. There are varying theories still to this day as to how many of the 11 murders on the Whitechapel murder file were in fact the work of the Ripper. But in 1894, Sir Melville Macnaghten, who at the time was Assistant Chief Constable and head of the Criminal Investigation Department, stated in a report that the Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims and 5 victims only. The police investigations themselves were carried out by the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, who became involved when Elizabeth Stride was killed. The Met Police investigation was headed up by Detective Inspector Edmund Reed, and he was later reinforced by officers from Scotland Yard. These were Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews. Detective Inspector James McWilliam was responsible for the investigation done by the City of London Police. As I mentioned before, at least 3 of the victims had body organs removed, leading police to believe that the killer had anatomical knowledge. But speculation was rife, and even Queen Victoria herself got involved. Her theory was that the killer was one of the cattle workers that came in on the boats that plied their trade regularly between London and the continent. This theory was soon discounted because the boat movements did not match the dates and times of the killings. The murders were widely reported around the world by the press. The New York Times in 1888 was particularly disparaging about the police investigation, and I'll quote it to you word for word. "The 4 murders have been committed within a gunshot of each other, but the detectives have no clue. The London police and detective force is probably the stupidest in the world. Now, was this a bit harsh? You've got to remember this was 1888. Forensic science was in its infancy. Give me your opinion. Tell me whether you think they were being overly harsh on the British police. Let me know below. But if you think that was incompetence on behalf of the police, wait until my next up-and-coming video. There will be another prime example of where investigations can go terribly, terribly wrong. Frustrated by the efforts of the police to catch the killer, some civilians took matters into their own hands, and they formed what became known as the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Groups of men patrolled the streets of Whitechapel armed with batons and police whistles, but despite their valiant efforts, no one was ever apprehended. In addition to the theory put forward by Queen Victoria, a number of different suspects were suggested. These ranged from a local man, an educated upper-class man, or even an aristocrat who had wandered randomly into the Whitechapel area. Some more outlandish suggestions ranged from Prince Albert Victor, the artist Walter Sickert, and even Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland fame. Today, there are a number of commonly reported suspects on record. Montague Druitt was a teacher and barrister who happened to have an extreme interest in surgery. He was rumoured to be insane, and after the killings ceased, he disappeared, but was later found dead. The physician Michael Ostrog, who came from Russia, was also under scrutiny. He was suspected to have homicidal tendencies, but no charges were ever brought against him, and he ended up in an asylum. Finally, there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew. He lived and worked in the area, and he came under suspicion because of his hatred of women, particularly prostitutes. Once again, no charges were ever brought, and he too ended up in an asylum. Once the murders stopped, the level of terror in Whitechapel began to diminish, and things seemed to calm down. Today, Whitechapel is a vibrant and bustling area of London, and looking around today, you'd be hard-pressed to realise that such a terrible number of crimes took place in the area. But here we are, still well over 130 years later, no closer to knowing the identity of Jack the Ripper. And that is utterly unbelievable. These terrible events that I've told you about happened many, many years ago. And now it seems almost surreal. It's sometimes difficult to believe they even happened at all. This horrendous episode has been romanticised in many, many books and films, such as From Hell, starring Johnny Depp. But I think it's important that we do not forget that these were real events. People actually died at the hands of a horrendous killer. And our thoughts go out to the descendants of the victims. So I hope you've enjoyed watching today. Please stay curious and stay safe, and join me next time. Oh, and by the way, part of the way through the video, did any of you notice the little pin badge that I was wearing? If you did, let me know what the pin badge was below. The first person with the correct answer will receive a mention at the start of the next video. Thank you for watching.